Roman soldiers were celebrated as heroes. But what happened to those who returned wounded from battle, especially from the empire's distant frontiers? Did the glory promised to these men hold up against the brutal reality of a mutilated body and a mind scarred by war? Few speak of the cruel fate of veterans who, after defending the borders, were left to fend for themselves. You might imagine these heroes receiving honors upon their return. But what if I told you that many were forgotten, left behind in foreign lands where extreme conditions and a lack of support made reintegration impossible? Today, we're going to dive into stories of sacrifice and abandonment, exploring how Rome treated its wounded veterans and how geographical distances and cultural differences shaped the fate of these soldiers. What you're about to discover reveals a dark side of Roman power, where honor turned into oblivion. Roman soldiers returning wounded from battles on distant frontiers were, for a brief moment, celebrated as heroes, but that glory was as fleeting as the dust they kicked up during their marches. In imperial Rome, war was a tool of power, and those who fought on the frontiers were seen as the front line of the empire's expansion. However, when their bodies bore the marks of battle and they could no longer serve in the army, many of these men discovered that their worth was tied solely to their ability to fight. There were no lasting celebrations for those who could no longer wield a sword. The promise of honor and rewards offered to soldiers, especially those fighting in border regions, fueled the troops' loyalty. But the reality for many wounded was quite different. Without a formal support system for disabled veterans, what remained for these men was oblivion or a return to a home that no longer recognized their pain. Instead of a dignified life after years of sacrifice, they were often relegated to begging in the streets of cities that, in times past, had regarded them as saviors. On the frontiers, the situation was even more brutal. The distance from the capital and the isolation of remote regions exacerbated the abandonment. Those who were wounded in battle but survived were often left in the very provinces where they fought. The empire, vast and dispersed, simply lacked a logistical network to bring all its wounded back. As a result, many veterans remained trapped in foreign lands, living among peoples who saw them not as heroes, but as invaders. Beyond the physical neglect, there was a devastating psychological impact. Roman society glorified strength and victory, while weakness and defeat were shunned. Mutilated veterans became a living reminder of mortality, something society preferred to forget. In ancient Rome, the image of the victorious soldier was essential for maintaining imperial power, and anything that threatened that narrative was quickly ignored. Wounded veterans represented a failure in the system that Rome simply chose to conceal. Imperial politics, in a way, reinforced this culture of abandonment. Rulers were more focused on current military campaigns and imminent threats to the frontiers than on addressing the issues of those who had already fulfilled their duty. The lack of effective state support created a disconnect between Roman ideals of glory and the real fate of many wounded veterans, turning them into victims of the very empire they defended with their lives. Life after war for many Roman veterans was a constant struggle between duty fulfilled and imminent oblivion. The Roman military system had no structured plan to deal with soldiers wounded in battle, and the future of these men was often uncertain. Those who didn't return to the glory of the battlefield faced the harsh reality of trying to reintegrate into a society that cared little for their scars. The men who had given everything for the empire now found themselves marginalized. The idea of retirement or fair compensation for wounded veterans was far from a priority in Rome. While the empire was known for providing land or rewards to some soldiers who successfully completed their service, those who returned disabled were left to fend for themselves. Many, unable to work, found themselves relying on alms or favors from family, if they were lucky. The state, in turn, offered no financial or psychological support for these men. Moreover, the transition from a life of relentless combat to a civilian existence was something Roman society did not fully understand. The wounded veteran was not just a man with physical injuries, but also someone deeply scarred by war, both in body and spirit. However, In the Roman view, this mental suffering was overlooked. The stigma of weakness prevented these men from seeking help, reinforcing the loneliness and isolation into which many fell. In the frontier provinces, where the presence of the state was more fragile, veterans faced even greater challenges. Without the support of family networks or the central government, they were often forced to live in foreign lands, surrounded by different cultures and languages. This geographical and cultural alienation made recovery even more difficult. Many of these men ended up precariously integrating into local societies or living as outcasts on the margins of an empire that no longer recognized them. The contradiction between the duty these men fulfilled and the oblivion they suffered is a cruel reflection of the empire's functioning. Rome, in its grandeur, depended on these men to expand its borders and maintain its power. But once they became unable to fight, their usefulness disappeared. And with it, any sense of obligation toward those who had once been its greatest defenders also vanished. The vast borders of the Roman Empire, stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, represented not only physical barriers, but also psychological ones for wounded veterans. These regions, far from the capital and the protection of major cities, placed soldiers in a vulnerable and isolated position. When a soldier was injured in these remote areas, the chance of being evacuated from the front lines and sent back to the safety of Rome was minimal. The cost and logistics involved in transporting incapacitated men were often deemed impractical, with priority always given to the next battle. This geographical isolation meant that many veterans ended up dying on the very frontiers they defended. The absence of an advanced medical system or adequate resources to treat the wounded in the empire's more distant regions forced soldiers to rely on the few options available. Military doctors, whose expertise often amounted to rudimentary care, and occasional help from local healers, if they were lucky. Even those who survived their injuries often faced a bleak future, trapped in lands where the culture and language were foreign. Veterans who managed to survive on the frontiers were left to live in local communities, often composed of conquered peoples or allies of Rome. In these regions, the ex-soldiers were not seen as heroes but as invaders or outsiders. Lacking the support of their families or any state structure, they had to adapt to a life of isolation, renegotiating their roles in societies that viewed them with suspicion. This cultural shock exacerbated the veterans' alienation, creating an invisible wound that, for many, never healed. In addition to social and cultural isolation, there was the problem of communication. On the empire's frontiers, news from the capital or centers of power often took weeks, sometimes months, to arrive. This meant that any plea for help or recognition for their services could get lost in layers of bureaucracy or simply be ignored. Wounded veterans, who had no voice in political and military processes, were easily forgotten amid the empire's new priorities. Their sacrifice, so essential for maintaining the borders, slowly vanished into the vastness of an empire that seemed too great to care. The isolation imposed by the immense distances of the empire was not just a geographical issue, but an emotional barrier that separated wounded veterans from any hope of reintegration. The loyalty these men felt toward Rome disintegrated as they realized that the empire, in its tireless expansion, no longer had a place for them. For many, the weight of distance became unbearable, leaving them forever on the margins of a history they helped to write. The borders of the Roman Empire were much more than imaginary lines. They were zones of constant tension, where diverse cultures clashed and the unforgiving geography challenged survival. For the soldiers defending these limits, hostility came not only from the enemy, but also from the environment in which they lived. Regions like Germania, Dacia, and the Near East presented extreme geographical challenges: dense forests, arid deserts, and impenetrable mountains. These adverse conditions not only complicated military campaigns, but also exacerbated the plight of wounded veterans who were often left behind after battles. The severe weather conditions of these frontiers made abandonment even crueler. A soldier wounded in a campaign in the icy mountains of Britain, for example, would have to face biting cold with open wounds and inadequate shelter. In the scorching deserts of Arabia, dehydration and lack of food could turn minor injuries into death sentences. The empire, in its thirst for expansion, underestimated the impact of these natural factors, and veterans became victims of both the battles and the environment. Culturally, the challenges were no less daunting. Forced coexistence with peoples resistant to Roman occupation created a dangerous dynamic. In frontier regions, wounded soldiers could be viewed with hostility by local populations, who saw them as symbols of oppression. Without the protection of the army, these veterans often found themselves in enemy territory, where they could not rely on the goodwill of the inhabitants. Instead, what they encountered was distrust or even direct hostility, making their recovery and reintegration even less likely. Moreover, the cultural diversity of the frontiers heightened the sense of alienation. Each region of the empire had its own traditions, languages, and customs, and a wounded soldier in foreign lands could find himself completely isolated, unable to communicate or understand the culture around him. This cultural shock, combined with physical and psychological difficulties, created an insurmountable barrier for many veterans. They not only lost their physical strength, but also their identity, becoming foreigners in lands they did not understand and that did not want them. The combination of a hostile environment and cultural diversity reinforced the cycle of abandonment. The empire, always focused on the next battles and the need to defend its borders, was unprepared to deal with the human consequences of these campaigns. Veterans who had once been Rome's shield became ghosts wandering the very lands they defended, invisible to the empire they served.